At 11:22 in the evening, Washington time, a series of encrypted calls began moving through the most secure communication channels the United States government operates. The recipients were not the usual roster of late-night duty officers and mid-level aides. These calls went directly to cabinet secretaries, to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, to the director of the CIA, and to a small number of senior senators who sit on the Intelligence Committee. By midnight, vehicles were pulling into the secure underground entrance of the Eisenhower Executive Office building. By 2 a.m., the Situation Room was fully staffed. The president had been briefed. And the question being asked behind those closed doors, a question that nobody in the building wanted to be asking, was a simple one: what exactly does Iran think it is doing, and what do we do about it now? What had happened in the preceding 72 hours was not a skirmish. It was not a miscalculation by a mid-level commander in a proxy militia operating out of some remote corner of Iraq or Syria. What Tehran had done, deliberately, methodically, and with a level of strategic boldness that caught American intelligence analysts off guard, represented a fundamental shift in Iran's posture toward the United States and its partners in the region. It was the kind of move that analysts spend years modeling in scenario planning documents and then quietly hope they never have to see executed in the real world. And yet, here we are. To understand what happened and why it matters so profoundly, you have to go back further than this week. You have to understand the environment that made this moment possible, the pressures that had been building inside Iran's political and military establishment for the better part of 2 years, the signals that in retrospect were hiding in plain sight, and the fundamental miscalculation that appears to have been made in Washington about just how far Tehran was prepared to go. Let's begin with what we know. Over the past several months, Iran has been conducting what intelligence officials have described, carefully and in measured language, as an accelerated enrichment program. This is not news, exactly. Iran has been enriching uranium beyond the limits set by the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, better known as the Nuclear Deal, since the Trump administration unilaterally withdrew from that agreement in 2018. But the pace and the technical sophistication of what has been observed in recent months at the Fordow and Natanz facilities has moved beyond what the International Atomic Energy Agency had modeled as the expected trajectory. Inspectors, where they have been permitted access, have documented enrichment levels approaching 90%, which is, to be precise, weapons grade. And in the weeks leading up to this crisis, Iran had begun restricting IAEA inspector access in ways that crossed thresholds that the international community had previously treated as the last available tripwire before the situation entered genuinely uncharted territory. That alone would have been enough to generate serious concern in Washington. But it was not the nuclear issue in isolation that triggered the emergency talks. It was what Iran did next. 3 days ago, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, the IRGCN, which operates separately from Iran's conventional naval forces and answers directly to Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, executed a series of coordinated maneuvers in the Strait of Hormuz that went well beyond what the United States had observed in any previous Iranian provocation. The Strait of Hormuz is, for those who need a geographic reference, the narrow choke point through which roughly 20% of the world's traded oil passes every single day. It is approximately 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. It is one of the most strategically vital waterways on the planet. And the IRGCN did not simply harass a passing American naval vessel or shadow a commercial tanker, as it has done on dozens of occasions over the past decade. What it did was more deliberate, and more alarming. According to initial reports corroborated by multiple sources familiar with the intelligence assessments, the IRGCN deployed what appeared to be a coordinated swarm of fast attack craft, supported by shore-based anti-ship missile batteries that were activated, not merely moved, but actively activated and brought to targeting readiness, in a manner that directly threatened 2 U.S. Navy vessels transiting the strait. Simultaneously, Iranian forces in Yemen, operating in coordination with Houthi leadership, launched a sustained drone and missile barrage at infrastructure targets in Saudi Arabia. And in Iraq, a militia group with well-documented ties to the IRGC's Quds Force conducted a rocket attack on a facility housing American military advisors, wounding several personnel. Take any one of those 3 events in isolation, and the U.S. national security apparatus has protocols for managing the response. Take all 3, executed in a compressed window of roughly 18 hours, and what you have is something that looks very much like a deliberate, synchronized demonstration of reach, coordination, and intent. That is what brought people into the Situation Room at 2 in the morning. Not one incident. 3. Now, if you are trying to understand why Iran would do this, why Tehran would choose this particular moment to escalate so dramatically, you have to put yourself inside the strategic calculation that the Iranian leadership is making right now. And it is not an irrational calculation, even if it is an extraordinarily dangerous one. Iran's supreme leadership has been watching a specific set of developments with deep concern for the better part of the past year. The Abraham Accords, which normalized relations between Israel and several Arab states, represented for Tehran a strategic nightmare, the erosion of the pan-Arab solidarity that Iran had always counted on as a buffer against a coordinated regional front. Then came the accelerating security partnership between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which, while not yet formalized, has been moving forward in ways that Tehran's intelligence services have been tracking closely. An Israel-Saudi normalization agreement, which the Biden administration had been quietly facilitating and which the current administration has shown continued interest in advancing, would fundamentally reshape the regional balance of power in ways that would be deeply threatening to Iran's strategic position. Add to that the sustained economic pressure of American sanctions, which despite Iran's various workarounds through oil sales to China and other mechanisms, has kept the Iranian economy under significant strain. Domestic unrest, which erupted so forcefully in 2022 following the death of Mahsa Amini and has continued to simmer beneath the surface, has created internal pressures on the regime that cannot be wished away. And crucially, Iran's nuclear program, the one card it holds that everyone else at the table has to take seriously, had reached a point where further delays in converting enriched material into an actual weapons capability would begin to carry diminishing strategic value. The window for using the nuclear program as a source of leverage, rather than simply as a target for military action, is not permanent. Here is what most people are missing in the initial wave of analysis: this escalation is almost certainly not driven primarily by the hardliners within the IRGC who are perpetually looking for an opportunity to confront the United States. The more alarming interpretation, and the one that appears to be gaining traction among senior American analysts, is that this decision was made at the highest levels of the Iranian government as a calculated strategic move. This is not a runaway militia or a rogue commander. This has the fingerprints of a leadership that has made a deliberate decision that the costs of continued restraint now outweigh the costs of escalation. That is a very different problem to manage. The immediate American response has been, by Washington standards, unusually swift and unusually unified. The emergency talks that began in the Situation Room extended through the night and resumed the following morning with participation from key allies. The British government was briefed through established intelligence channels. The Israeli Prime Minister's office received a secure communication from the Secretary of State before dawn. Gulf Cooperation Council partners, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, were brought into a parallel track of consultations. The message being communicated to all of them was essentially the same: this is a serious escalation, we are assessing our options, and we need to know your current posture and your tolerance for various levels of response. What makes this moment particularly fraught is the timing within the American domestic political context. The current administration is operating with a foreign policy team that is still managing simultaneous crises: the ongoing war in Ukraine, the deeply complicated aftermath of Gaza, the accelerating strategic competition with China in the Indo-Pacific, and now this. The bandwidth question is real. Senior officials who were supposed to be focused on one set of problems are being pulled into an emergency engagement on another. And the political pressure from Congress, particularly from the hawkish wing of both parties that has consistently pushed for a harder line on Iran, is already building. Within hours of the initial reports becoming public, statements were being issued from Capitol Hill demanding immediate and decisive action, a phrase that sounds compelling from a press release but is considerably more complicated to operationalize when you are sitting across a table in the Situation Room looking at a map of the Persian Gulf. Let's talk about what the strategic options actually look like, because this is where the analysis gets genuinely difficult. The United States has, broadly speaking, 4 categories of response available to it. The first is a predominantly diplomatic track, using back-channel communications, through intermediaries like Oman, which has historically served as a quiet conduit between Washington and Tehran, to convey red lines and explore whether there is a negotiated off-ramp available. This approach has the advantage of keeping military risk low. Its disadvantage is that it can be read, by Iran and by regional partners alike, as a signal of hesitation or weakness, particularly given the severity of what just occurred. The second option is a calibrated military demonstration, an increase in naval presence in the region, additional aircraft deployments to regional bases, perhaps a visible exercise designed to signal American capability and resolve without crossing into actual kinetic engagement. The United States has significant assets available for this purpose. There is already a carrier strike group in the region, and the Pentagon has both the assets and the logistics infrastructure to reinforce quickly. The signal this sends is important, but its effectiveness depends on whether Iran is actually deterred by demonstrations of capability, or whether at this point Tehran has already discounted American willingness to escalate to actual military force. The third option is targeted sanctions, new and more aggressive economic measures designed to impose costs on the specific individuals and entities within the IRGC and the broader Iranian system responsible for the coordinated actions we just witnessed. The argument for this approach is that it is non-kinetic, reversible in theory, and imposes real costs. The argument against it is that the Iranian economy has been under heavy sanctions for so long that the marginal impact of additional measures may be limited, and that Tehran has become adept at adapting to economic pressure in ways that do not require the regime to change its behavior. The fourth option, the one that no one in the Situation Room wants to be discussing but that everyone knows is on the table, is some form of direct military action. This could range from a limited strike on specific IRGC naval assets to a more comprehensive operation targeting the infrastructure supporting Iran's missile and drone programs to, at the extreme end, the scenario that has been wargamed and studied and debated for 20 years, a military operation targeting Iran's nuclear facilities. Every one of these options carries enormous escalation risk. Every one of them could trigger Iranian responses that cause significant harm to American forces, to regional partners, and to global energy markets. They are not chosen lightly. But they are on the table, and the fact that they are being seriously discussed in Washington right now is itself significant. The historical parallels that analysts are reaching for right now are instructive, though they are also, in each case, imperfect. Some are drawing comparisons to the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, and there is something to that analogy: the sudden escalation, the compressed decision-making timeline, the sense that miscalculation by any party could lead to consequences that spiral beyond anyone's control. But the Cuban crisis involved two nuclear-armed superpowers in a direct confrontation with clear geographic boundaries and established communication channels. The current situation involves a regional power that is nuclear threshold but not yet nuclear-armed, a web of proxies operating across multiple countries, and a set of communication channels that are, to put it generously, less than fully reliable. Others are reaching back to the 1973 oil embargo, pointing to the potential economic disruption if the Strait of Hormuz were actually closed or significantly disrupted. That parallel carries weight. A sustained disruption of traffic through the strait, even a partial one, even one that lasted only a few weeks, would produce an energy price shock that would reverberate through every major economy on the planet. Oil prices would spike dramatically. Inflation, which the global economy has only recently begun to bring under control, would reignite. The political consequences in every major consuming country would be severe. Tehran knows this. It has always known this. The question is whether it is prepared to actually use that leverage in a way that would invite retaliatory action capable of causing severe damage to Iran itself. And perhaps the most uncomfortable parallel, the one that experienced regional analysts are raising in quiet conversations, is the summer of 2006, when Hezbollah's capture of 2 Israeli soldiers triggered a rapid escalation that drew in multiple actors, produced devastating destruction in Lebanon, and ended in a political outcome that satisfied almost nobody and resolved almost nothing. The concern is not that the current situation will replicate 2006 precisely, but that the same dynamic of miscalculation and rapid escalation could produce a war that nobody planned for and nobody knows how to stop once it begins. What is the Israeli dimension of all this? Because it cannot be ignored. Israel has been watching Iran's nuclear program with an existential intensity that no American official, however committed, can fully replicate. The Israeli security establishment has been conducting its own assessments of the Iranian nuclear timeline for years, and those assessments have consistently concluded that the window for preventive military action, if such action were to be taken, is narrowing. The events of the past 72 hours have intensified debates within the Israeli government about whether the moment for independent action has arrived or is rapidly approaching. Prime Minister Netanyahu, who has staked his political career in part on the Iran threat, is under enormous pressure from within his own coalition to respond to what is being characterized in Israeli political discourse as an intolerable provocation. The question of whether Israel acts unilaterally, and if so, what the United States does in response, is not an abstract scenario planning exercise right now. It is an active and urgent conversation happening at the highest levels of both governments. The Gulf Arab states present a different but equally important dimension of the picture. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which have their own complicated and historically tense relationships with Iran, are in an interesting position. The Abraham Accords normalization process and the broader security architecture that Washington has been building with Gulf partners gives them a stake in how this crisis resolves. But they also recently completed their own diplomatic re-engagement with Tehran, the Chinese-brokered normalization that took place in 2023, which means they are simultaneously inside a security architecture that is preparing contingency responses to Iran and maintaining a diplomatic relationship with Tehran that they worked hard to establish. That is a deeply uncomfortable position, and how the Saudi leadership navigates it in the coming days will tell us a great deal about the durability of both of those relationships. China's role deserves careful attention as well. Beijing has significant economic interests in Iranian oil exports, has been buying Iranian crude at discounted prices in defiance of American sanctions, and has positioned itself as a diplomatic interlocutor with Tehran in ways that give it leverage that Washington does not possess. The Chinese government will almost certainly use this crisis as an opportunity to position itself as the responsible party urging de-escalation, which is a posture that serves Chinese interests in multiple ways simultaneously. It distances Beijing from the escalation, it reinforces China's narrative of American destabilization of the region, and it gives China diplomatic credit with Arab states that are anxious about where this is heading. Expect significant Chinese diplomatic activity in the coming days, and expect the content of that activity to be watched very carefully in Washington. Now let's turn to where this goes from here, because ultimately that is the question that matters most. The first scenario, and the one that most experienced diplomats will tell you they are hoping for, even if they are not confident about it, is a managed de-escalation. In this scenario, the back-channel communications through Oman or another intermediary produce a quiet agreement in which Iran signals that the immediate provocations were intended as a message and not as the opening move in a sustained campaign. The United States responds with a visible military reinforcement of the region, communicates its red lines clearly, and both sides step back from the immediate edge. Some form of diplomatic contact, possibly indirect, resumes on the nuclear issue. This scenario is possible. It has happened before in the US-Iran relationship, which has a long history of escalation followed by managed de-escalation. The concern is that the current escalation was so coordinated and so deliberate that it may reflect a strategic decision within Tehran that cannot simply be walked back through the usual diplomatic channels. The second scenario is a prolonged period of elevated tension without open conflict, what might be called a slow burn. Iran continues to advance its nuclear program, continues to enable proxy activity at a level calibrated to be disruptive but not so severe as to compel a major American military response, and uses the threat of further escalation as a negotiating tool. The United States reinforces its regional presence, tightens sanctions where possible, maintains strong statements of commitment to regional partners, but does not move to direct military action. This scenario is deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved, particularly for Israel and for Gulf Arab partners who are directly in the line of fire. It also carries the inherent risk of miscalculation, that at some point, one action by one actor in one corner of this complex situation goes a step too far and triggers an escalation that nobody intended. The third scenario is the one that keeps people awake at night. It is the scenario in which either the United States or Israel concludes that the time for managing and containing Iran's nuclear program has expired, and takes direct military action. The consequences of this scenario are genuinely difficult to model, and analysts are honest about that difficulty. Iran has developed, over years of preparation for exactly this contingency, a distributed and hardened military and nuclear infrastructure that is designed to survive strikes and retain retaliatory capability. An Israeli strike, or an American strike, or a combination of the two, would not simply end Iran's nuclear program. It would damage it, set it back, by estimates that vary widely but cluster around 2 to 5 years, and it would almost certainly trigger Iranian retaliation against American forces in the region, against Israeli territory, against Gulf energy infrastructure, and through the full range of proxy capabilities that the IRGC has built and sustained across the Middle East. The scale and duration of what follows such a strike is genuinely unknown. The risk of it becoming a full regional war is, by most serious assessments, substantial. There is a fourth scenario that is rarely discussed in mainstream analysis but that deserves mention, because it reflects a possibility that cannot be entirely dismissed. It is the scenario in which Iran's leadership has concluded that the current trajectory, sanctions, isolation, the narrowing nuclear window, the regional security architecture building against them, is already an existential threat, and that the only way to fundamentally change the strategic environment is to actually cross the nuclear threshold. To test a device. To announce it. To present the world, and particularly the United States and Israel, with the fact of Iranian nuclear capability rather than the continuing negotiation over the prospect of it. This scenario is assessed by most analysts as unlikely in the near term, but the fact that it is on the table at all, and that the intelligence community continues to monitor for indicators that Iran has made or is close to making that decision, tells you something important about where we are. What is perhaps most striking about this moment, if you step back and look at it in its full context, is how much it represents the convergence of pressures that have been building for a very long time. The collapse of the JCPOA, the Abraham Accords, the regional proxy wars, the economic warfare of sanctions, the domestic instability within Iran, none of these are new developments. They have been accumulating, interacting with each other, creating a strategic environment of increasing fragility and decreasing margin for error. What happened in the past 72 hours is in one sense a sudden shock. In another sense, it is the product of years of choices made by multiple governments that have brought us to a point where the options available are all costly, all risky, and none of them good. The emergency talks in Washington will continue. More allied consultations will follow. There will be statements and counterstatements, assessments and reassessments. The intelligence community will be working around the clock to determine exactly what Iran's intentions are and what its next move is likely to be. Diplomatic channels that have been dormant will be quietly activated. Military planners will be updating contingency plans that they are paid to have ready and that they hope never to use. And through all of it, the question that will hang over every meeting and every conversation is the same question it has always been with Iran, the question that has resisted resolution for decades because it sits at the intersection of genuine strategic complexity, deeply held ideological commitments, domestic political pressures in multiple countries, and the constant background hum of the worst possible outcome. How do you manage a relationship with a government that you cannot trust, cannot fully contain, cannot simply coerce, and cannot afford to ignore? There is no easy answer to that question. There never has been. But the urgency of finding a workable answer has rarely been as high as it is right now. What happens in the next 2 to 3 weeks will matter enormously. The signals that Washington sends, the private communications that flow through back channels, the decisions made in Jerusalem and Riyadh and Tehran, all of it will shape whether this moment becomes a managed crisis or something significantly worse. The situation is not yet at the point of no return. But the margin for error is thin, the actors involved are under pressure from multiple directions, and history offers us ample evidence that crises with this many moving parts and this many competing interests have a way of exceeding the boundaries that everyone assumed would contain them. We are watching a pivotal moment in Middle East geopolitics unfold in real time. The consequences of how it is navigated, or misnavigated, will be felt not just in the region but in every capital and every economy that depends on the stability of a world in which the Persian Gulf remains open, in which nuclear weapons are not used, and in which the architecture of international security, however imperfect, continues to hold. Pay close attention to what happens next. The decisions being made right now, behind closed doors in Washington and in the other capitals involved in this crisis, will be studied by historians and analysts for a very long time. Whether they will be studied as examples of sound strategic judgment under pressure, or as cautionary tales about how great powers and regional actors stumble into consequences they did not intend, that question, as of right now, remains entirely open.